Ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, I'm Lionel Morrison. I'm a member of the Black Members Council of the National Union of Journalists. It is now with the greatest pleasure that I welcome you to the 13th NUJ Claudia Jones Memorial Annual Lecture. Now, this year, the Black Members Council and the NUJ and Thomson Reuters Black Employees Network are co-hosting the Claudia Jones Memorial Lectures for the third year. Dear colleagues, these lectures are part of the Black History Month celebrations, lectures and activities, and will be the 13th Claudia Jones Memorial Lecture, which was set up by the BMC in 2002. And this theme this year is scrolled as "Take Me to Your Leader." This is the crisis in the leadership in Black Britain. All of the lecturers, activists, historians, academics, journalists, sociologists, and public figures have made powerful and seminal contributions in a wide range of relevant themes, and the establishment of the lecture has become one of the highlights of Black History Month in London. Now, as journalists, and more importantly, as a journalists' union, we chose to honor the memory of Claudia Jones, founder and editor of one of Britain's first black newspapers, the West Indian Gazette, and her friend and colleague, Machanda, who helped her in setting up the paper and the Afro-Asian Caribbean News. If that had been Claudia's only contribution to Black history in Britain, it would have been a significant achievement on its own, not least because as a woman, she would have suffered the double oppression of being both a woman and being black. And that was in the days before equality was legally recognized. Even it is not fully upheld, nor is the spirit of the equalities law embraced today. But Claudia also helped to found Notting Hill Carnival, which would become a permanent celebration of black pride and multicultural friendship. Claudia was incarcerated 4 times on Ellis Island between 1951 and 1955, and she was a prisoner too. Like many of us today are prisoners. We are prisoners of the inequalities, prisoners of the bigotry and racism which encircles and strangles us. The legacy that Claudia left was all the more remarkable in that she was hounded, censored, and persecuted for her political opinions, for which of a short life. The system tried to destroy her, but she endured. It was an amazing achievement. And so, the legacy of Claudia's must be kept alive to remind those who are unaware of the work she and so many other black unsung heroes had done in making the world a better place for black people to live in. It is a year when some political parties and media outlets continue to blame the struggle, the surge of racism, on the black victims' failure to integrate. They are still attempting to explain the alienation of Muslim youth by questioning the multiculturalism and by fierce attacks to strip it of its anti-racism roots. The NUJ is firmly of the belief that press freedom must be conditioned by responsibility and in acknowledgement by media workers of the need not to allow press freedom to be abused, to slander a section of the community, or to promote the evil of racism. It is a year, 21 years after the murder of Doreen Lawrence, when a number of political parties, and just as adamantly, some mainstream media outlets, newspapers and broadcasting stations, have been trying to give political clout and legitimacy to openly racist Islamophobia and xenophobia ideas which amounts to a democratization of racism. When we began the annual series of lectures, our goal was, and still is, to raise the level of discourse and understanding of race and related issues in the context of Black History Month. And as journalist colleagues and members of the NUJ, we are aware of the responsibility to challenge and to scrutinize, making sure that racism is exposed in the media. Colleagues, we're living through a time when the concept of entitlement, like access to health care, a decent wage, good education, a decent home, a job, and the ability to participate in society itself is being fiercely contested. It demonstrates both the magnitude the complexity, and the entrenchment of some of the problems facing Britain and Britain's black communities. We realized it was necessary to hold up Claudia's life as a mirror, that the best way to honor her legacy was to examine our world in the reflection of hers and to see what light would be thrown. The National Union of Journalists is pleased to announce that the speaker at this year's NUJ Claudia Jones Memorial Lecture will be Patrick Younge. Patrick is a highly regarded executive broadcaster with international experience at senior levels in journalism, commissioning, production, public service, television, digital media, and pay TV. He began his career at London Weekend TV and has now worked for the BBC, Channel 4 TV, Travel Channel Media US, and is now the founder and director of We Create Associates Limited, which offers consultancy services in all aspects of commercial and public sector media. Patrick has led teams responsible for making well-known programs such as Strictly Come Dancing and Dragon's Den. And whilst working as head of programs and planning for BBC Sport, he was directly responsible for scheduling more than 1,000 hours of sport output annually across BBC One and BBC Two including programs such as Grandstand, Rugby Special, and Sports Personality of the Year. In 2007, Patrick was awarded the Fellowship of the Royal Television Society, and since 2010 has been selected every year as one of the 100 most influential black people in Britain. Mostly, and that is mostly, Patrick is an activist who has and is continuing making a unique contribution to the fight against racism, and his reports and writings are incisive, having inspired many of us and are firmly in the mold of Claudia's beliefs. At a time when many of the goalposts are being moved, we are sure that Patrick's challenging and thought-provoking lecture, which will explore the barriers and challenges that people of color face in achieving success in today's society, will be a worthy addition to the previous 12 lectures. Welcome to the 13th Annual Claudia Jones Memorial Lecture, which is being held during the 50th anniversary of Claudia's death on Christmas Eve this year. Welcome to our guest speaker, Patrick Younge.
Ooh. Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. First of all, I think I should start with I'm going to take my glasses off because I can just read better without them on. First of all, I think I should start with an apology, a clarification, I should say, which can serve as an apology for those of you who misread the invitation. A few months ago, I was contacted by Lionel, who was the first black president of the NUJ, and I was invited to give this lecture. And my answer was immediate and direct. Lionel, I said, hold on a minute, you've come through to Pat Younge, Gary Younge's brother. Give me a minute and I'll get you his number. This happens quite a lot, you see, and actually Lionel called me Gary just about 10 minutes ago. No, Lionel said, convincingly, it's you we're after, and he explained why. And he managed to, and he persuaded me to do the lecture. But in closing, he added, anyway, Gary did this 5 years ago. So, I'm delighted to be here tonight, following in the footsteps of my younger and more famous brother. But seriously, I'd like to thank the NUJ Black Members Council and Thomson Reuters Black Employee Network for the great honour of speaking to you all tonight. Now, just briefly, in terms of my own background, I'm one of 3 sons raised in Stevenage, Hertfordshire by a single West Indian mother. I went to a state school. I studied mining geology at Cardiff University, and I started my career in television at London Weekend Television in 1991. I've launched and run various shows, including Devil's Advocate with Darcus Howe, Black Britain, Here and Now. I'm a former NUJ Father of Chapel and Black Members Council member. In 2001, I became a senior manager at BBC Sport. And 5 years after that, I went to the States where I ran Travel Channel Media, a cable network in 90 million homes across the States, and the creator of shows like Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations, and the one you probably have heard of, which is Man vs. Food. After leading the sale of that business for $1 billion in 2009, I came back to the UK to run BBC Television Production. That's some 3,000 staff in 8 bases across the UK and home to some of the UK's biggest brands: Strictly Come Dancing, EastEnders, Casualty, Holby, Top Gear, BBC Natural History, Citizen Khan, AdFab, Mrs. Brown's Boys. It was a job I did for 4 years and I loved it. But earlier this year I left to set up my own consultancy which specialises in innovation and creative leadership. So this annual memorial lecture is dedicated to the memory of the late Claudia Jones. Now last week I was working with someone who I didn't think was that much younger than me. She probably was much more younger than me, but you live and hope. And I was talking to her about Enoch Powell when she admitted that she didn't know who Enoch Powell was. So rather than assume your knowledge, I want to take a minute just to add to what Lionel said about Claudia to make sure that we honour her properly. As Lionel said, she's probably best known for taking the lead in launching what's become the Notting Hill Carnival following the 1958 race riots. But her story is much, much, much more interesting than that. Born Claudia Cumberbatch in Trinidad in 1915, she moved to New York aged 8 with her family and 3 sisters. In the 1930s, she became an active member of the American Communist Party, and as a very talented journalist, she became the Negro Affairs editor for the party's newspaper. Now, Claudia understood the centrality of women to any genuine liberation movement or struggle. Black women she described as being super exploited, both as workers, as women, and then as black people as well. In 1949, she wrote, quote, "The super exploitation of the Negro woman worker is revealed not only in that she receives less than equal pay for equal work with men, but in that the majority, the Negro women, get paid half the pay of white women. Little wonder then that the maternity death rate for Negro women is triple that of white women. Little wonder that 1 in 10 Negro children doesn't grow to manhood or womanhood." Now that kind of biting polemic and her general political activity is what led to her being arrested and spending those 4 spells in prison before she was deported from the USA in 1955. Refused entry to Trinidad, she was granted asylum in Britain, something I don't think would happen now. In London, she became a leading figure of the emerging black rights movement, as many immigrants were being discriminated against in housing and employment. And again, something that my children and other young people don't realise is that that was entirely legal at that time. She also understood the power of media, claiming, quote, "People without a voice were as lambs to the slaughter." So in 1958, she founded the West Indian Gazette, the first newspaper printed for the black community. It provided a unique forum for discussion of civil rights, as well as reporting news that was overlooked by the mainstream media. Again, could we possibly do with that today? Until her death in 1965, she continued the struggle against immigration controls, against racial discrimination, and for the release of Nelson Mandela, which is well before it became trendy. All of us stand on the shoulders of this pioneering journalist and activist. Now, Claudia Jones was clearly a leader, which brings me to the theme of tonight's speech, Take Me to Your Leader, the crisis for black leadership in Britain. Just a note before I start, or before I really get into it, just a note on language. I could use BAME, I could use visible minority, I could use black and Asian, I could use Afro-Caribbean, African, Asian, Chinese, I could use the new black, whatever that means. For tonight, I'm going to use the word black, and I'm going to use the word black to cover them all. Now, it's been quite a tough speech to wrangle, because the question in itself raises so many further questions. For example, is there a crisis facing black leaders today? Or is there a crisis in the quantity of black leaders that we have? Or is there a crisis in the quality of the black leaders that we have? Is it a public sector crisis? Is it a private sector crisis? And my exploration of these themes drew me to ask a bigger set of questions, more fundamental questions. What is a leader? And is a black leader different to any other kind of leader? And if so, how? And if not, does it matter? And at its core, I've come to what I believe to be the major underlying issue, which is that we have a crisis of collective purpose. Now, this is happening at a time when nationalism, especially English nationalism, is on the rise in the UK. And white people are now being talked about as the forgotten many. It's happening at a time when the government is insisting that British values are now promoted in schools, and there's serious talk about removing our protection under the European Human Rights Act. It's happening at a time, and you didn't hear this reported yesterday, when the unemployment rate amongst young Pakistani and Bangladeshi people is running at 46%. And the unemployment rate for black, British, and African Caribbeans is running at 45%. That's 45% and 46% of people under the age of 25 from the black and Asian communities unemployed, compared to 19% of the white community. If there was a time for black leadership, it's now. But do we have the leadership that we need? That's what I'm going to explore. Now, the expression, "take me to your leader," comes from a 1950s cartoon. It's what extraterrestrial aliens who've just landed in a spaceship say to the first human that they happen to meet. To me, it also mirrors how many reporters and journalistic colleagues report on stories from the black communities compared to elsewhere. The truth is, the story breaks in the black community, the reporters arrive, they identify a local, and then they ask, "Take me to your community leader." The truth is, most news organisations don't really know or understand our communities. How do I know this? Well, when I started in television in 1991 as a researcher on the London programme, they were doing a film on Brixton 10 years after the riots of 1981. Like many people who work in television, your first route in is often something which is ethnically related, and that was my route in. Now, they needed someone who could go to Brixton and knock on doors and identify stories, and they had no black people on the team. So they advertised for the job. Remember the days when people used to advertise for jobs? They advertised, and I applied, and I got it. Then, 3 years later, I decided to leave LWT. By this time, I'd noticed that there were just 2 black men on television, both called Trevor. Trevor Phillips and Trevor MacDonald. And they seemed to be cleaning up. And I decided I wanted some of their action. So I applied for an on-screen correspondence job at BBC South East. Now, this was just after the deaths of Joy Gardner and Stephen Lawrence. We were witnessing the rise of the BNP in Tower Hamlets and growing racial violence across London. So I went to see a senior exec to find out what they were looking for from the post holder. And their answer was, "We want someone who can explain to us what's going on out there." Refreshingly honest, perhaps, but also exposing the bankruptcy of how our communities are understood in the public space. Now, the funny thing about these community leaders is that they're rarely elected. Instead, they're usually anointed by the people who seek their opinion. The beauty of this approach, and that's probably what happened with Dizzy Rascal, the beauty of this approach is when they start to say the wrong thing, they can be denied the oxygen of coverage and replaced by someone more compliant. Another thing worth noting, only black people need to have community leaders. In the public arena of civic society, everyone else has head teachers, priests, vicars, councillors, police chiefs, and others who can speak to an issue or contextualise a story based on their role, their knowledge, and their experience. Black people, 9 times in 10, get a community leader. If you don't believe me, just watch the news. And the next time you hear the word community leader, look at the race of the person being introduced. It's an idea so ingrained in the consciousness of British media that my official BBC role was titled Community Affairs Correspondent. Now, I argue that the only reason the media can get away with this is because of the very low levels of black representation in the key roles in public space and public life. After all, only 6% of head teachers and 8% of health board chairs come from an ethnic minority background. Last year, research was released showing that out of 18,000 professors in the UK, just 85, that's less than half of 1%, are black. And across the UK, we have just 35 black women professors. There are currently no black general secretaries in the Labour movement, and if you look at Parliament, there were just 27 black MPs. There are just 27 black MPs, whereas if Parliament reflected modern Britain, there'd be more than 90. There are virtually no black employees in the top 4 grades of the civil service. There's only one black local authority CEO in London, and only 4% of the councillors in this country are black. Now, I was born in 1964. I came of age really in the 1980s, when we had many black council leaders, Bernie Grant, the late Bernie Grant, Linda Bellos, Merle Amery, to name but 3. And we had administrators like Herman Ousley, Heather Rabatz, Gus John, and Russell Prophet. Today, I actually think we're going backwards in the public space in terms of representation. And it's because of that failure, these unelected and therefore unaccountable so-called community leaders can often get away with acting as gatekeepers rather than as leaders and enablers. Take the recent grooming scandal in Rotherham, where over 1,400 young people are thought to have been exploited, and a disproportionate number of Pakistani heritage men involved in that exploitation. The official report found, and I quote, "Both the council and the police used traditional channels of communication with the Pakistani heritage community for many years on general issues of child protection. These contacts were almost exclusively with men." That's from the official report. So they did communicate with their traditional channels, which I think means mosques and imams, but may have involved the odd councillor, and almost exclusively male. So what might they have found if they'd spoken to the Pakistani heritage women in Rotherham? Well, in compiling the report, they spoke to one of the local Pakistani women's groups who described as follows. They described how Pakistani heritage girls were targeted by taxi drivers and on occasions by older men lying in wait outside school gates at dinner time and after school. They also cited cases in Rotherham where Pakistani landlords had befriended single Pakistani women and girls on their own for purposes of sex and then passed their name on to other men who had then contacted them for sex. The women and girls fearing reporting of such incidents to the police would affect their future marriage prospects. The women's group also provided the inquiry with detailed descriptions of the grooming and the nature of the abuse suffered. And the report found, and I quote, "Their description mirrors the abuse committed by Pakistani heritage perpetrators on white girls in Rotherham. With hindsight, it's clear that women and girls in the Pakistani community in Rotherham should have been encouraged and empowered by the authorities to speak out about perpetrators and their own experiences of sexual exploitation, so often hidden from sight." So if the authorities had spoken to the Pakistani origin women in Rotherham, who weren't at that stage the leaders, this may have been revealed sooner, and many children, black and white, could have been properly protected. I think Claudia Jones may have been able to tell them that 50 years ago. But also just reflect on the coverage of the Rotherham abuse scandal, and it is a scandal, and then consider how much coverage you've seen on the abuse of Pakistani origin women. Maybe it was there and I missed it, but I doubt it. So the public space is pretty depressing. What about the private space? Well, at least here we started from a low base, so we can talk about progress. And just to be clear, everybody, I do welcome the progress that we have made to date. The question I'm asking is, How much progress has there been, and could there be more, and what do we need to do about it? So let's start with the FTSE 100, the 100 biggest companies on the UK Stock Exchange. A company called Green Park Leadership did an analysis of the FTSE 100 looking at diversity in the top 3 roles. That's the chairman, the CEO, and the CFO. Now, in a population of 289 people, just 10 were black, or about 3%. Now, when you look at the top 20 full-time managers of the FTSE 100, some 65 companies have no black full-time manager in their top 20. Put it another way, some 2/3 of the biggest 100 companies in Britain have all-white executive leadership. Think of our media. There is only one black person on the boards of BBC, ITV, Channel 4 and Sky combined. BBC trustee Sunita Lane, and she was only appointed 6 months ago. And there is just one ethnic minority editor of a national newspaper, Amal Rajan, at The Independent. Race for Opportunity, in their recent report, Race to the Top, found that the share of black people in top management has increased by just 0.5% between 2007 and 2012. But in real terms, the number of black people in top management jobs has decreased from 95,000 to 73,000, a drop of nearly 25%. Even the national game, football, out of the 92 professional league clubs, there are currently only 2 black managers, despite over 30% of the players having black backgrounds. Now, most companies' organisations are trying to improve representation at the top, or at the very least they are paying lip service to that goal. And there are lots of things that can and should be done about this. You could have a much more aggressive approach to talent pipelines and succession planning and succession readiness. We could adopt the Rooney Rule, which was introduced into the NFL in America, to ensure that a black coach is at least interviewed for every major NFL vacancy that comes up. Now, the impact of the Rooney Rule is they went from having 2 black coaches in the first 80 years to currently having 12 black coaches just last year. And so why couldn't we introduce that to Premiership football? Indeed, why couldn't we even consider introducing that more widely and insisting that companies for certain jobs seek out and interview at least one suitably qualified black person? We could take leaves out of the various initiatives which have been successful in increasing the number of senior women. So there's a body called the Davis Panel, which was set up by Vince Cable in 2011 to increase the number of women on boards from 12.5% to 25% by 2015. So double the number of women on boards in just 4 years. They've already reached, in 2014, they've already got to 23%. So it shows you what leadership and targets can do. And there's now talk of a similar initiative aimed at black people. Now, I've also seen these types of initiatives when I was at the BBC. We had an initiative there called the Women's Development Initiative. And John Burt decided that there weren't enough women coming through the system. And so he created this initiative where they identified 20 or 30 of the most senior and the next generation of BBC leaders, women. And they met as a group on a number of occasions. They all had personal coaches. They all were introduced to every single part of the BBC. So it didn't matter what part of the BBC they worked in, they were given briefings on television, on radio, on strategy, on new media, on local TV and radio, so that they were better prepared to apply for any of the next round of senior jobs that came up. And because they were highly networked as a group, when one of them got through, they were in a position to pull the others through. And so if you look at those women who've reached the top of the BBC, people like Helen Bowden, Lorraine Hegarty, who was the first woman controller of BBC One, Jane Root, controller of BBC Two, Caroline van der Brul, Jana Bennett, all of these people came through that initiative. The one question I ask about that initiative and a number of these other initiatives, and I'd even ask it of the Davis Initiative, is how many of those people are black? Black women don't seem to have benefited very much from these general initiatives aimed at women. And so that's one thing that, but there are lots of different things we could do. There are lots of strategies which are proven, which could increase the number of people at the top. But what I really want to explore is that bigger question, why does it matter? Sure, it's great for the individual as they seek to achieve their potential, to develop their career, their earnings and their prospects. And of course, it's great for other black people inside the company to see that advancement to the top is possible. And yes, it's great for the company because hopefully they get a broader range of people at the top table. And also they get off the various watch lists that people like me reel off at speeches like this. But does having more black people on boards necessarily improve the lot of black people generally? Don't forget, the targets aren't set on the number of black people that use a product or service. The targets are set on the number of black people in the population, i.e. the targets are set on behalf of the black community at large. And so if the targets and the opportunities are being created in their name, we should be in a position where we can ask, do they benefit? And the reality is, and I know it because I've lived it, when you get to those levels, you are not there as a representative. Put another way, you are not there as a proxy union rep for black people. At the end of the day, no matter how conscious you are or aware you are, you're there as a business or functional leader, and that's how you're judged. That doesn't mean you can't raise issues, and it doesn't mean you can't work to make a difference in the areas that you control. But there are no mechanisms to create agendas or to create accountability to ensure that your efforts extend beyond the efforts of the company in terms of impacting the community at large. So it's a conundrum. It's a conundrum, I've faced it myself many times. For example, when the BBC wanted to move thousands of jobs from London to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and Salford, I knew, amongst other things, it meant moving jobs from an area where there was a significant black population to areas where there were much smaller black populations or effectively none. And that meant moving jobs from where black people lived and had a chance of getting them to areas where they didn't live, and at the very least they'd have to consider relocating in order to stand a chance. Now, I believed then, and I still believe now, that the BBC's bigger strategic interest of demonstrably delivering jobs and services around the UK was more important than protecting work in London. And as a consequence of that, that meant it was more important than protecting jobs in the area where most black people lived. But that was a decision I took because I was there looking at the BBC as a whole. That was my job at the level I was at, was to think about the organisation. And of course you put in all sorts of ideas to try and mitigate. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't expect from people outcomes which they're not there to deliver. They're there to do a job. We want them to do that job well. But we shouldn't expect them to do things that they're not there to deliver. So if improving a lot of black people in general is not the primary concern of a black leader, why do we spend so much energy pushing for more seats at the top? And the reason, I believe, is because we've confused hierarchy and position with leadership. Leadership has nothing to do with positional authority. And leadership has nothing to do with titles, and it has nothing to do with management. Leadership is a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. That is the classical definition of leadership. A process of social influence that maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. So leadership doesn't have to come from the upper echelons of professional success. A good black leader could be a postman in Glasgow, a clergyman in Leeds, a Pakistani mother in Rotherham, or an entrepreneur in London. The most inspirational and influential black leader in Britain for me in recent years has been Doreen Lawrence. She found herself forced into a leadership position with a goal of seeking justice for her son. And as her influence grew, so did the areas of public life that her campaign impacted. Lenny Henry has taken up a leadership position in his campaign for broadcasters to ring-fence funds to enable black portrayal and employment. which has now become the yardstick against which the broadcasters' efforts are being measured. And notice what happens as a consequence of people taking up leadership positions in the real world. By pushing for their improvements, those making the case for change within the organisations, whether that's the Society of Black Lawyers, the Black Police Association, the TV Collective, or individual leaders, they gain leverage and influence to push the agenda internally. External pressure is often needed to push the agenda internally. Miriam O'Reilly won her legal action against the BBC for age discrimination, and suddenly there was a welter of initiatives around older women on the BBC. Quite often it's external pressure that drives internal results and creates space for those of us involved in these issues to act. Now, I know many of you, like me, are actively engaged in trying to develop the next generation of talent and give back to the communities that we come from, perhaps through mentoring or through your religious establishment or through speaking in schools and in a myriad of other ways. And that's all great, and it's absolutely to be commended. And I would suggest if you're not already engaged in those sorts of activities, then you should be, frankly. And I hope those of you who aren't will make a personal commitment to yourself today. But even then, given the challenges that we face, I'm not sure that it's enough. Remember that definition of leadership, a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. The question I want to ask is, what are we all fighting for? In the past, it may have been easier. We were fighting to end discrimination, to get the Race Relations Act, to free Nelson Mandela, for our right to self-organise in the workplace, union or Labour Party. And many of those battles have been won. But racism and discrimination persist. And our efforts today are increasingly atomised. I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had about the phrase black community and what it means in 2014. So I believe what we need is a collective goal or goals. That way our individual efforts can be multiplied and prioritised. I think we need a shared agenda so that our progress can be measured. And most importantly, I think we need to reconnect to a purpose bigger than ourselves and encourage others to do likewise. I don't have the mechanism for how we might achieve that. There's a lot of talk about networking and digital networks, but I think it needs to be more than a network. We need to find some new form of community. We need to find some new forms of accountability. We need to find some new ways of engaging with each other as people interested in this space. But as the late C.L.R. James said, you can't solve a problem until you understand the problem. So the answers aren't easy and the work will be hard. But we need to find a way to build that collective sense of purpose that we once have and I believe we've lost. Otherwise, we risk a massive disconnect between the impoverished many and the privileged few. Martin Luther King once said, change doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent. Well, I think it's time to stand up, people. I think it's time to stand up and be counted. Thank you.